He walked across the field. Toward the opposing dugout. Before a game. In the specific charged atmosphere of a rivalry series pre-game, when batting practice is winding down and the competitive machinery of a Padres-Dodgers matchup is beginning to pressurize and the invisible line between the two organizations that runs through the center of the diamond is at its most defined and its most deliberately maintained. He walked across that line. Toward Shohei Ohtani. And what he asked, quietly, directly, with the specific vulnerability of a professional athlete approaching someone from the opposing team and asking for something that professional athletes almost never ask from opposing players, stopped the people nearby cold enough that several of them turned to look without quite meaning to. The request took approximately 45 seconds to deliver. Ohtani's response took approximately 3 seconds. He said yes. And what happened in the 30 minutes that followed, in the space between batting practice and first pitch, in the corner of the field where two players from two rival organizations stood together doing something that U.S. media would spend the next several days trying to fully process, became the kind of story that baseball generates when it remembers, briefly and completely, that the competition is the surface and the humanity is what runs underneath. The Padres player's name was Elias Diaz. A catcher. A veteran. Someone who had spent enough time in professional baseball that the resume attached to his name carried the weight of genuine, sustained excellence rather than the front-loaded promise of a prospect who has yet to be tested by the accumulated difficulty of a long career. He had been struggling. Not in the way that produces headlines or generates analytical deep dives or becomes the subject of the kind of sustained public attention that baseball media brings to prominent players in visible slumps. In the quieter, more private way that veterans struggle when something mechanical has drifted from where it needs to be and the experience that is supposed to make fixing it easier is instead making it more complicated, because experience carries memory, and memory sometimes insists on patterns that are no longer serving the person they belong to. His swing had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that was immediately visible to casual observation. But in the specific, measurable way that batting practice footage reveals when you overlay current mechanics against the baseline that defined a player at his best, the way that a few degrees of adjustment in the hip rotation, a few inches of drift in the hand path, can compound across a season into results that bear almost no relationship to what the player is actually capable of. Diaz knew something was wrong. He had known for several weeks. He had worked with his own hitting coaches. Had spent extra time in the cage. Had watched film with the analytical staff and heard explanations that he understood intellectually and could not convert into the physical correction they described. And then, in the specific way that desperate problems sometimes generate unexpected solutions, he had an idea. The idea came from watching Ohtani bat. Not from a single at-bat. From the accumulated observation of a catcher who had spent significant innings behind the plate receiving pitches while Ohtani stood 60 feet away in the batter's box, who had seen, from the specific vantage point that a catcher's position provides, the complete mechanical picture of what Ohtani does when he hits. Diaz had been watching that picture for 3 years. And in the weeks since his own mechanics had started drifting, he had found himself returning to what he had observed from behind the plate, the specific quality of Ohtani's hip rotation, the way his hand path remained consistent through different pitch locations, the weight transfer that produced exit velocities that didn't seem possible from a body doing what bodies do under the time constraints that pitching imposes. He had started thinking, what if I asked him? The thought arrived and he dismissed it. They were rivals. From organizations that competed in the same division with the specific intensity that proximity produces. There was no precedent for it. No framework within the professional architecture of opposing teams for one player to approach another and say, I have been watching you hit for 3 years and I think you know something about hitting mechanics that I need to understand. He dismissed the thought. It kept coming back. By the morning of the series opener, it had been coming back long enough and with enough persistence that Diaz made a decision. He was going to ask. He found Ohtani near the batting cage during pre-game. Approached with the specific body language of someone who has committed to a course of action and is not going to allow the discomfort of the next 60 seconds to redirect them. He said, Ohtani. Can I ask you something? Ohtani looked at him. Nodded. Diaz said, "I've been watching you hit for 3 years. From behind the plate. I've had a better view of your mechanics than almost anyone." Ohtani waited. Diaz said, "I'm struggling with something in my swing. Something mechanical. My coaches have looked at it. I've watched the film. I can't fix it." Then said, "I think you might see it. If you watched me hit. I think you see things that most people don't see. And I'm asking, before the game, right now, if you would watch me take some swings and tell me what you notice." The people nearby who heard this exchange described the silence that followed as lasting longer than it actually lasted, a few seconds stretched by the weight of what had just been asked into something that felt more significant than its duration. Ohtani looked at Diaz. Then said, "Show me." They walked together to the far end of the batting cage. Not quickly. Not with the rushed efficiency of two people trying to complete something before anyone notices it's happening. At the ordinary pace of two professionals moving toward a shared purpose, carrying with them the specific comfort of people who have communicated honestly with each other and arrived at an understanding. Diaz picked up a bat. Ohtani stood behind him. To the right. At the angle that provides the clearest view of the hip rotation in the early phase of the swing, the angle, notably, that is almost identical to the view a first base coach has during a game. He said nothing while Diaz took the first 3 swings. Watched with the concentrated attention that the people who observed from a distance described as identical to the attention Ohtani brings to reading a pitcher from the batter's box, the full-body stillness of someone who is processing information at a rate and depth that their external appearance does not advertise. After the 3rd swing, he said, "Stop." Diaz stopped. Ohtani said, "Your front foot is landing closed." Diaz said, "I know. My coaches told me. I've been trying to open it." Ohtani said, "You're trying to open it from the foot. Open it from the hip first. The foot follows the hip. If you start with the foot you're working backward." Diaz looked at him. Then took a swing. Then stopped. Then said, "Oh." That word, one syllable, exhaled rather than spoken, was the word that the people nearby would mention first when they described the exchange. Because it carried the specific quality of recognition that arrives when something that has been wrong for a long time suddenly becomes right, not gradually, not through incremental improvement, but in the single moment of understanding that makes the preceding weeks of unsuccessful effort collapse into a before and after. Diaz took 3 more swings. Then 3 more. Ohtani watched each one. Said 2 more things, small, specific, technical observations that landed with the precision of someone who had identified not just the primary mechanical issue but the secondary compensations that had developed around it. By the 10th swing, something visible had changed. Not everything. Mechanical corrections don't complete themselves in 10 swings after weeks of drift. But the direction had changed. The swing was moving toward something rather than away from it. And Diaz's body language, the specific, subtle quality of a hitter's body language when they feel something working versus when they feel something not working, had shifted in the way that coaches spend careers learning to recognize. Ohtani said, "Better. Keep working from the hip." Diaz nodded. Then said, "Why are you helping me?" Ohtani said, "You asked." Diaz said, "We're rivals." Ohtani said, "In the game. Right now we're just 2 people talking about hitting." The story reached U.S. media before the first pitch was thrown. Not through either of them. Through the witnesses, the batting practice personnel, the players from both teams who had been in the vicinity of the far cage and had watched what unfolded with the particular attention that unexpected things command when they occur in familiar environments. By the time the game began, the accounts were circulating. By the 3rd inning, the broadcast team had received enough information to reference it on air. By the 7th, it was the story that the baseball world was discussing alongside the game itself. The reactions divided along lines that baseball debates typically divide along, the traditionalists who felt that helping an opposing player, regardless of the spirit in which it was offered, represented a competitive boundary that should not be crossed. And the larger group, encompassing people from inside and outside the sport, for whom the story produced something simpler. Warmth. The uncomplicated, immediate warmth of recognizing something genuinely good in a world that generates sufficient amounts of the alternative. The former players who weighed in did so with the candor that the moment seemed to invite. One said, "I played 20 years in this league and I never once considered asking an opposing player for hitting advice. Not because it wasn't allowed. Because the competitive culture of the sport makes it feel like a concession. Like an admission." Diaz walked across that line and it took something. And Ohtani met him there and it took something too. I think that matters more than people are giving it credit for. Another said, "The thing Ohtani identified, working from the hip rather than the foot, that's not a revolutionary concept. Hitting coaches teach that. What's remarkable is that he saw it in 3 swings from watching someone else hit. That's not just a great hitter. That's someone who understands the mechanics of hitting at a level that most players spend their entire careers trying to reach." A third said simply, "He became that man's coach for 30 minutes before a game against his team. And then he went out and competed against him. That's the most baseball thing I've ever heard. And I mean that as the highest possible compliment." Diaz went 1 for 3 in the game. His one hit was a hard ground ball to the right side, the kind of contact that happens when a swing is working in the right direction even if it isn't fully there yet. The exit velocity was higher than his recent average. The launch angle was more consistent with his historical profile. Small things. But baseball is a sport of small things accumulating. After the game, in a brief exchange with a reporter near the Padres clubhouse, he said, "I'm not going to give away the specific adjustments. That stays between us. But I will tell you this, Ohtani really became my coach out there. For 30 minutes before a game we were both supposed to be focused on winning. He gave me 30 minutes of his time and his knowledge and he didn't ask for anything back." The reporter asked, "What does that tell you about who he is?" Diaz was quiet for a moment. Then said, "It tells me that the greatness isn't just in the home runs and the pitching. It's in the way he thinks about the game. The way he holds it. The way he's willing to share it with someone who needed it, even when that someone is standing on the other side." Then said, "I won't forget it. However the rest of this season goes. I won't forget that he said yes." Ohtani was asked about it at his post-game availability. He was brief. In the way he is brief when the thing being asked about belongs to a register of experience that he considers private even when it has already become public. He said, "He asked for help. I helped. That's it." A reporter said, "Did it feel strange? Helping a rival?" Ohtani said, "Hitting is hitting. The uniform doesn't change the mechanics." The reporter said, "Do you think it will help him?" Ohtani thought about it. Then said, "If he keeps working from the hip, yes." He almost smiled. Then said, "He'll figure it out. He's been playing this game a long time. He just needed someone to show him where to look." He picked up his bag. And walked out of the room. Into the evening. Where the next game was already approaching. And where Shohei Ohtani, competitor, pitcher, hitter, and apparently, coach, would be ready for all of it. As he always is.